الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
استووا استقيموا سدوا الفرج. Strain the lines, close the gaps. Please make sure you complete each line, inshallah. Allahu Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم. لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي فمن يكفر بالطاغوت ويؤمن بالله فقد استمسك بالعروة الوثقى لا انفصام لها والله سميع عليم. الله ولي الذين آمنوا يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور والذين كفروا أولياؤهم الطاغوت يخرجونهم من النور إلى الظلمات أولئك أصحاب النار هم فيها خالدون. ألم تر إلى الذي حاج إبراهيم في ربه أن آتاه الله الملك إذ قال إبراهيم ربي الذي يحيي ويميت قال أنا أحيي وأميت قال إبراهيم فإن الله يأتي بالشمس من المشرق فأت بها من المغرب فبهت الذي كفر والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. أو كالذي مر على قرية وهي خاوية على عروشها قال أنى يحيي هذه الله بعد موتها فأماته الله 100 عام ثم بعثه قال كم لبثت؟ قال لبثت يوما أو بعض يوم قال بل لبثت 100 عام فانظر إلى طعامك وشرابك لم يتسنه وانظر إلى حمارك ولنجعلك آية للناس وانظر إلى العظام كيف ننشزها ثم نكسوها لحما فلما تبين له قال أعلم أن الله على كل شيء قدير. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وإن تبدوا ما في أنفسكم أو تخفوه يحاسبكم به الله فيغفر لمن يشاء ويعذب من يشاء والله على كل شيء قدير. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون كل آمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم.
Assalamu alaikum. Today, for our suhoor, we would like to thank a group of Sudanese sisters who would like to remain anonymous. They put up a wonderful feast, I would say. Not really suhoor, but we all enjoyed. Very well organized. As it rained last night heavily, they could not keep to the venue as they planned last night. They had to make all the changes early morning. So you can imagine the amount of work they had to do. Thank you, everybody, for this extraordinary effort. May Allah accept their efforts and then also give them barakah in their life. Salam.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. So today we're going to talk about a prophet of Allah, among others. And it just so happens that the ayat that were recited are actually about him. But I had not coordinated that, it just happened. So this is the Nabi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Uzair alayhi salam. And he is someone who is mentioned in the Quran by name, which is وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ عُزَيْرٌ ibn Allah. That some of the Yahud believe that Uzair is the son of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very lesser known, you could say, belief within the Jews. Perhaps it is not something that you hear about nowadays, that they don't really have the concept of the son of Allah, son of God in our time. But perhaps, definitely, not perhaps, definitely there was a group of Jews that must have believed because the Quran told us so. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the story of a man, and Allah does not mention his name, but rather it is the Mufassirin that say that this is this person, and they say the reason why the Jews said he is the son of Allah is because of this incident, or not incident, this miracle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him. So the way the story goes, and again, remember that our source for most of the stories of the prophets is Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya. And Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, we already mentioned in the beginning that the use of Israeliyat is there. So, yeah. Jazakumullah khair. MashaAllah. Didn't even have to say a single word. So, one thing I'm noticing is that it's the end of Ramadan, and I'm noticing the people's patience is running low in all different aspects. So let's hold it tight for a few more days. At least let the shaitan come out, right? Why are we snapping? And even shaitan is not there to give us that push. So at least hold it down a few more days. And hopefully when food and drink opens up, more water going into the body, maybe more positivity can come back in us. But it is understandable that everybody is pushing themselves. Less sleep, less food, less rest, less water. And, the patience is low, people are snapping. So inshallah, try, if you feel like snapping, see if you can walk away and save your fast, save your Laylatul Qadr. There were a bunch of kids the other night. They kept coming to me. They were saying, this kid, we found him. He's hiding over there. Come with us so we could go catch him. I'm like, guys, tonight could be Laylatul Qadr. And you guys are spending your night chasing a bunch of other Muslim boys to try to get them caught and in trouble. Wouldn't it be an idea that you could leave that for another day and today focus on your ibadah? But of course, that was their game, which is like one day they were the bad guys and the other guys were the good guys. Now the all the bad guys came together and they formed the UN. So now they're going after the other guy. So, League of People. Anyways, so the history, remember we talked about the temple, which is called the Temple of Sulaiman, which was essentially Masjid al-Aqsa. And this temple, in the Jewish history, the first temple has been destroyed, and the second temple has been destroyed. Now, Masjid al-Aqsa is something that the current structure is something that was not really there for the most part. The structure is not really, the structure is not divine. The land itself underneath is what the holy place is, right? Same thing in Mecca, same thing in Medina. The structure is replaced from time to time. There's no problem in that. Now, subhanAllah, one thing to think about is that why is it that the temple that the Jews consider to be the holiest, which is, like I said, their Masjid al-Haram, their Kaaba, why has it been destroyed, completely decimated, not a brick left unturned, twice in history? Why do you think? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, ضُرِبَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ الذِّلَّةُ وَالْمَسْكَنَةُ وَبَاءُوا بِغَضَبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. And he says, أَيْنَمَا ثُقِفُوا. That because of some of their deeds, which is killing the prophets of Allah, and opposing the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, breaking their covenant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them a punishment, which is, it will follow them wherever they go. And of course, we're talking about the evil ones. Are there good people from among them? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ مَنْ إِنْ تَأْمَنْهُ بِقِنْطَارٍ يُؤَدِّهِ إِلَيْكَ. They are honest ones that if you give them an entire treasure, they will give it back to you. Among them are those who Allah says, يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ. They are good people. This is recognized. And their goodness, we hope, will bring them to Islam. Will bring them to Islam. And if you look at when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, his initial interactions with the Jews are very positive. But when they started scheming, that's when the interactions turned negative. Eventually, they had to be kicked out of Medina. But subhanAllah, you look at, for example, what is called anti-Semitism in Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe, meaning before they all went and occupied this land in Palestine, basically wherever they were, for some reason, they were hated by people. There was so much anti-Semitism, they said, okay, we need to have our own land. But subhanAllah, the Quran has the answer, which is stop doing, killing the prophets of Allah, changing the book of Allah, stop commanding evil and forbidding good. And especially what's happening now, subhanAllah, that the world day by day is turning against the Zionist. And they're starting to see the reality that these people, they play the victim card, but they're really not victims. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant our brothers and sisters victory against the oppressors. So, Uzair, and Allah does not mention the name, but again, it's the connection that the Mufassirin, like Ibn Kathir and others have made, that this is Uzair, that he came to a deserted, ruined place in Jerusalem. And it was basically that haikal, or the temple, or the masjid, which had been destroyed by a king called Nebuchadnezzar. And in their, whatever had happened, they basically said, okay, you know what, we need to just destroy their temple and kick these people out. They can't be here. So Uzair passes by this place and he makes a comment. It was in such devastation that you could not imagine this place ever coming back to life. Something like what you would see in Gaza right now. That you would walk there like, okay, is it even possible to rebuild from this level of destruction? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to teach him a lesson that it's not up to you and your resources and your ability and your willingness to bring something dead back to life. It is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bring anything to life whenever He wants. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes him fall asleep. Or when we say asleep, it is a sleep for 100 years, and which is essentially death. And you could say different words for it, that hibernation, because meaning if it is, he's there in some sort of a cave, he's sleeping there, and his body is there, not harmed by anything, does not deteriorate. It remains there. Then he wakes up, and again, if you sleep, you wake up, you're like, well, when I went to sleep, it was 2 p.m., it's 4 p.m. now. You don't assume that the date changed. Only sometimes if you're really sick, you have like a surgery or something, you have like some sort of strong medication, you go to sleep, you wake up the next day, and until somebody tells you, you don't realize that the day changed. I slept for like 24 hours. He slept for 100 years and woke up, and he notices something strange, but he's like, well, the sun was there, now the sun is here. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent an angel to ask him, how long do you think? And he says that he probably slept for a day or part of a day. A day or a part of a day. Then the angel told him that he slept for 100 years. He slept for 100 years. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed Uzair an example of how the dead will be brought to life by reviving Uzair's donkey. Now, if you think about it, normally when they do a science experiment, what they do is that they have a control and they have a placebo, right? And they will put them side by side, and they will basically give medication to one of them, and then they will observe both to make sure that is this medication actually having an effect, or is just like maybe a placebo effect that the air heals you, for example, just time heals you. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He puts them in the same area, same cave or whatever. One of them completely deteriorates, which is the donkey, but he doesn't. So meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, there's no comparison that no one can come and say, well, you know what, it was probably like something imaginary. Maybe it was, the cave had some sort of, chemicals in the air which were life-giving, and, so it should have happened, the same thing should have happened to both. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changed one for one and another for another. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in front of him, He brings the bones together, brings the bones of the donkey together. Then the bones are covered with flesh, nerves, blood vessels, and skins, and then the donkey becomes alive. This is literally like in today's day and age, there are YouTube videos like that, where a 3D model, bones come together, then flesh comes on it, veins come around, and then skin comes, and then the baby starts talking. Uzair alayhi salam, he literally sees it in front of his eyes. Donkey becomes alive. Now, Uzair now gets out of this cave or wherever he is. He comes out of it and he goes back to town where he lives. And of course, what do you see? 100 years have passed. Everything has changed. There are some videos from the early 1920s that are coming out, like, in New York, somebody set up a big camera, somebody did it in London, in big cities, and you look at this. So imagine you go to sleep when the world is like that, and then you wake up, which you are thinking, I just woke up like a few hours later, and now the world is like this in 2024. So, of course, everything has changed, and he's looking at them, and they're looking at him. Who are you? And he says, I'm Uzair. You guys don't know me? And of course, everyone that knew him has already died, except for one woman who has gone blind. And this woman used to be a young maid in the house of Uzair. So, in the back in the days, they would have a maid which was maybe like 7, 8 years old. So, this young woman had seen Uzair when he was young. and must have some sort of a, identifying trait. And she was blind now. She was so old, she was blind. So, so the people said, so Uzair alayhi salam, he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cure her blindness. And he did, and she saw Uzair, and she said, this is indeed him. This is indeed him. Now the people did not believe Uzair, that he was who he was, and they thought that this was someone who was trying to use a famous name, and he is basically like a fraudster. And they said that this old lady is lying. She's part of the conspiracy. So Uzair had a son. And his son said that my father, and of course the son would have been, almost 100 years old now. So he would have been more than 100 years old. He said, my father had a mark between his shoulders in a specific spot, and it was a black mole. So they checked him, and they found that, and they said, okay, this is indeed Uzair. Now, what was the outstanding thing about Uzair is that he was someone who had memorized the Torah. He had memorized the Torah, and when the temple was destroyed, the Torah was also destroyed in it. And the people did not have an original copy anymore. And of course, if you don't have it memorized, then basically maybe somebody has 10 lines, somebody has 20 lines, that's all you have, the rest of it is gone. So Uzair had memorized it, so there was only one copy of the Torah, which was hidden by Sarukha, and he had buried it in the days of Nebuchadnezzar in a place none but Uzair knows. So Uzair had them, led them to the hidden place, and the copy of the Torah had already deteriorated, but Uzair then copied the Torah again from them, and he basically, whatever could not be read, he had memorized it, so he was able to bring back and revive the Torah in this way. So, of course, the lesson that, many lessons that we can learn from this, among them is, in our time, for example, what a blessing that we have that the Quran is memorized by hundreds of thousands of people in every generation. And we often give the example to non-Muslims that, look, if you were to take all of the copies of the Quran and you were to burn them or to throw them in the water or something, then the Quran would be back again in no time, because we have walking Qurans, hundreds of thousands of them. So, and also, never think that if something has been destroyed, that it cannot come back alive. It is only the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is needed. That's all. And we have seen in history people, nations that have been destroyed and they never came back because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they will not come back. And there have been nations that have been destroyed in such a way that you would never imagine that this nation will ever rise again. In our time, in our lifetime, we have seen the examples of the modern Japan and Germany, right? That with the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan, and with the devastation of Germany by the Allied powers, we don't really understand much, except Gaza is the closest example, where they used to have this concept of carpet bombing, where they're literally basically laying a carpet of bombs in an entire city. And you would never imagine that these nations will rise. Germany was a leading power in World War I, and only about 30 or so years later, it is again a leading power in World War II. And it is devastated in World War II, and then it comes back again that right now, Germany is again one of the leading nations of the world in terms of engineering, in terms of, from a dunyawi perspective, it is what it is. So it is really, I would say that with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for us as a nation, it is not that difficult, but the mindset has to be changed. I would say that when we look at, for example, from a worldly perspective, when we look at people like Japanese and Germans, their mindset is a different mindset. And I'm sure that people that have traveled there, they have experienced, one of the things they have, for example, in Japan, is something about cleaning toilets. Anybody know about this? So in Japan, there's a culture that the CEOs of the company, they clean the toilets of the company. They clean the toilets. And I'm sure you might have seen some YouTube videos where when it's, basically you go to the bathroom and the guy who's cleaning is the CEO. And they say that this is one of the habits of success among the Japanese people, among a number of others. One of them actually something to do with shoes. What is it with shoes? We definitely don't have that. Which is that whenever they go and they take off their shoes, Japanese also inside their house, they don't take the shoes. If you ever see, there's a YouTube video that I saw, it was very impressive. And one day I was thinking of, sharing it with people maybe in a khutbah, like, hey, these are things that we should be practicing. That when we come, we throw our shoes, one here, one there, right? But every single shoe pair is very carefully put together, put in a very, very clean and meticulous way. And, these are small little traits that show something greater. It shows a sign of a certain type of mindset, which is that what we have is, let me consume now, let me eat now, and I will worry about everything else later. But if you change the mindset, and the same thing, goes with regards to sustainability, thinking about using stuff that doesn't harm the environment, that if we change the mindset and we say, no, it's not that we're going to eat first and then worry about everything else. We're going to worry about it as we are eating. So we're going to try to find the right thing to eat in, and then take care of it properly at the same time. Instead of saying, okay, let me just please myself first, and then we will worry about it later. So it is, the famous ayah in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change within a people until the people change what is within themselves. So we mentioned this before, that up until the worldwide, you could say, downfall of the Muslim world, up until then, this ayah was interpreted to mean that as long as the Muslims remain upon their deen, they will remain victorious. They will remain a dominant force in the world. And when we are now reading this same ayah in the era of powerlessness, humiliation at the hands of others, now we interpret the same ayah as saying that until we change the bad habits inside of us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change within what is within us. So, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا لَا يُغَيِّرُ بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. So the next two prophets we have, inshallah, we will quickly cover them. We don't have a lot about them, which are the father and son prophet. So who are these two prophets? The father and son. Zakaria alayhi salam and Yahya alayhi salam. Zakaria is mentioned 7 times in the Quran, and the specific thing which is mentioned about him is that he was making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a long time to grant him offspring, And this is something that, if anyone is tested with the same difficulty, it is something that they can relate with. The pain of not having children. Your life is enjoyable when you have people to enjoy it with. There's a certain time, up until a certain age, you can enjoy with your brother, with your sister, with your cousins. But a certain age comes where at that time, if you don't have a wife, if you don't have kids, if you don't have a husband, at that time, it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter, how much power, influence, corporate jets and all of that stuff you have. Life is not really enjoyable. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all of those brothers and sisters who are being tested with this trial to relieve them of this difficulty. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala find all those who are looking for righteous spouses. May Allah grant them. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all those who do not have children. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them righteous children. Now, this wasn't my topic, but it just came to me that those who especially don't have children, they should be thinking about. I mean, everyone should be thinking about it, but especially those who are tested with this, they should think about adopting Muslim orphan children from these disaster-hit areas. It's very difficult for many parents. Like, I've had this talk with my wife, and she says, you know what, because we have our own kids, I'm afraid that if we take in a child, I will not be able to be just and fair with them. That I might oppress that child more. But, you know, these are things that we need to have this conversation at a bigger level, that we don't, they call it adoption. In Islam, we don't call it adoption, we call it kafala, guardianship. We follow the whole adoption process from the worldly perspective, but from an Islamic perspective, we are essentially taking in a child whose parents have passed away, doesn't have anyone to take care of, bringing them and raising them as best as we can, as best as we can. So if you think about, you know, some of the celebrities, they really put us to shame. You know, what we do is that if I am, for example, if I'm Pakistani looking, if I go to adopt a child, who am I going to adopt? Someone who kind of looks like me, right? If I am Chinese looking, who am I going to adopt? Someone who looks like me. But these people, you look at their kids, someone looks Chinese, someone looks Vietnamese, someone looks this way, someone looks that way, and they raise them as their children. And it is, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them with the guidance because of this good quality that they have. But it is really something that we should think about. And if you're not able to at least do that, we are mostly blessed with plenty of extra wealth. Some things that we could do is to take sponsorship of orphans at the very least. But money is one thing. Besides money, what we should also be thinking about is that, think about if you never came to see your child. You only sent them money. That child grows up hating their dad. Because he says, Dad, I don't need your money. I want you. I want you to come and sit with me and talk to me. So if we get a chance, whenever we get a chance, whether here or elsewhere, to try to visit places, to maybe take some of those kids out to Six Flags or things that dads would do with their kids. These are things that are very, very, very rewardable. And remember, we mentioned that one of the ways in which you get a reward, if you're worrying about an orphan, you get the reward of praying nights and fasting days to spend maybe a little bit to maybe talk to a kid, have a good conversation with them, give them some advice, you know, maybe take them out for ice cream and things like that. So anyways, going back to Zakaria alayhi salam. He's mentioned in the Quran 7 times by name. And it is mentioned that Zakaria, he supplicated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he had become very old, his wife was barren, and he asked Allah for a child to inherit him and to inherit the religious knowledge and prophethood. To inherit the religious knowledge and prophethood. Now, it seems that, you remember we said that until from Musa alayhi salam until Isa alayhi salam, the scholars say that Bani Israel never had a time except that they had a prophet among them. But here, Zakaria alayhi salam is getting old. Perhaps he's thinking, I'm going to die soon, and there's no other prophet around him. And he's thinking that if I had a child, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant him this. So he's making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, Ya Allah, give me someone who will inherit this knowledge and continue this. He's making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded to Zakaria alayhi salam, and he said that he would give him he would be given a son, and the son's name would be Yahya, and no one before him has ever been named this name. And Yahya, it comes from the word life itself. That Yahya alayhi salam is an amazing, beautiful name, and that Allah gave this child the name. Allah gave him the name. Zakaria alayhi salam requested for a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said the sign was that he would not be able to talk to people for 3 days, even though he was not sick. So, like, is there something that's going to happen? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him that you're going to lose the ability to talk for 3 days. So when that happens, you know that, okay, something is happening. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that even in those 3 days, he went and he gave da'wah to people and he gave them good advice and admonition with his indications, even though he was not able to speak, because of course the prophets of Allah, their job is to convey the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to command the good, forbid the evil. Banu Israel disliked Zakaria and they planned to kill him. Any surprise there? Zakaria alayhi salam escaped into a forest and hid inside a tree. And Shaitan came and showed them the tree and gave them the idea to cut the tree in half. That he is inside, he's hiding there. This tree has miraculously closed to protect him. Cut this tree down. Again, these are from the Israeliyat. Then we have the mention of Yahya alayhi salam 5 times in the Quran by name. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that he had some amazing qualities. Number 1, that he was wise even as a child. So he's a child, but he talks very wise. He's knowledgeable, he's obedient to his parents, and he's always weeping out of fear of Allah, hope and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, love and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Yahya alayhi salam also met a cruel death. King Herod planned to marry his beautiful niece Salome, and Yahya alayhi salam, being a prophet and basically the law, if you want to know is this halal or not, you ask the prophet. So Yahya alayhi salam said that the marriage would not be allowed, and it is against the law of Torah. Why? Because you cannot marry your niece. Your niece is your mahram. So they basically schemed. They said, okay, the only way for us to get through this is to kill him, get him out of our way. And subhanAllah, this urge to marry someone, to be with someone, is so strong that so much has been done in the world because of this. If you think about that, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church was formed because the King of England wanted to marry a woman who was, he wanted to divorce his wife and marry someone else. And the Catholic Pope said, you cannot, this is against the law. He said, okay, you know what? Forget you, we're going to make our own church. And he made himself the king, the head of the church. So until today, the crown, whoever is the queen or the king, they are actually the head of the church. And he said, okay, I will make my own church. And he brings his own token priest and says, is this allowed or not? They said, yes, your majesty, you can do whatever you want. So they allowed it. So they ordered Yahya alayhi salam to be executed, and his head was brought and presented. And the Prophet ﷺ said, when we reached over the second heaven, during the Miraj, I saw Yahya alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam, who were cousins. This is a hadith in Bukhari. So inshallah, this is what we have. Inshallah, tomorrow, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, we'll talk about the last prophet before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, which is Prophet Isa alayhi salam. Inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Inshallah, it is sunrise, if you give it a little bit more time, inshallah, pray 2 rakat and have the full reward of a Hajj and Umrah.